A man's garden is dying under the weight of a single thorn. Can he find the strength to remove it, or will bitterness destroy everything he loves? Journey with Simon as he discovers the healing power of forgiveness, and how letting go of anger can restore both a garden and a heart. Simon stood at the edge of his beloved garden, watching the sun climb slowly over the hills of Galilee. The warmth of the morning light kissed his weathered skin, yet he couldn't shake the heaviness in his heart. His garden had once been his pride, a paradise of vibrant blooms that spread like a colorful tapestry across the fertile earth. Roses, lilies, violets, and daisies filled the space, their colors almost too bright to be real under the soft blue sky. Simon had spent years cultivating this land, tending to the soil, pruning the branches, ensuring every flower had room to grow and stretch toward the heavens. The garden had become his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the worries of life, a reflection of the peace he sought in his own soul. But now, there was a presence in the garden that disturbed the balance he had worked so hard to create. A thorn bush, small at first, had started to sprout in the far corner, where the roses grew thick and lush. At first, Simon had overlooked it, too busy with the other tasks that called for his attention. He had pruned the roses, watered the lilies, and swept the ground, but every time his gaze fell on that thorn bush, a sharp discomfort ran through him. Its thorns seemed to poke at the edges of his patience, growing faster and more stubborn with each passing day. Simon had tried to pull it out once, but it fought back. Its roots dug deep into the soil, entwining with the earth like a stubborn parasite. Each time he tried, the thorns scratched at his fingers, tearing his skin until finally he had given up. In his heart, a sense of anger and frustration began to grow, just as the thorn bush did. It was as though the bush mocked him, unwanted and out of place. Why doesn't it just go away? Simon thought, his grip tightening on the wooden handle of his rake. He had spent years nurturing the garden, and now this thorn, so small yet so persistent, seemed to defy him. With each passing day, it dug deeper into his soul, feeding off his resentment. Simon found himself glaring at the thorn whenever he passed, his heart filled with bitterness and a desire to destroy it once and for all. Yet every time he tried, it seemed to grow taller, more resilient. The garden he loved so much was slowly becoming consumed by it. His roses were wilting in its shadow, their once pristine petals curling at the edges, losing their brilliance. The delicate violets, which had once been bright and playful, were now struggling to keep their heads upright. The lilies, which had always been proud, stood stiff and listless. It was as though the very life of his garden was being drained by the presence of this one thorn. The peaceful serenity that once filled the air was now replaced with an overwhelming sense of frustration. Simon walked through the garden, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth, and stopped to inspect the thorn bush once again. His mind was clouded with thoughts of how to rid himself of it once and for all, but none of his methods seemed to work. Why won't it leave me in peace? He thought bitterly. What have I done to deserve this? He ran his fingers over the petals of a rose, its edges brown and curled, and a wave of despair swept over him. The garden had always been his escape, his place of solace. Now it felt like a battlefield, a battleground between him and the thorn that wouldn't die. With every passing day, the thorn seemed to grow deeper, its roots sprawling like the bitterness that festered in his own heart. Miriam was a young woman from the village, someone Simon had watched grow from a little girl into a bright, inquisitive soul. He had seen her running through the fields, laughing with the other children, her feet light and free. Her eyes were full of curiosity, and there was a certain lightness about her that Simon admired but also envied. Where she saw joy, he saw only the weight of responsibility. Where she saw life, he saw decay. Miriam had always been fond of Simon's garden, often stopping by to marvel at the flowers and to ask him about the different plants he tended. He had grown accustomed to her visits, though they were always brief, like fleeting moments of sunlight in a storm. One bright morning, as Simon was bent low, pulling weeds from the base of the roses, he heard a familiar voice. "Good morning, Simon," Miriam called out cheerfully from the path. Simon looked up from his task, wiping the dirt from his hands and standing slowly. He straightened his back and looked toward her, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, Miriam," he said, trying to keep the heaviness from his voice. "What brings you here today?" She stepped closer, her sandals soft against the dirt, and gave a small shrug. "Oh, I was just passing by and thought I would see how your garden was doing. It's always so peaceful here." Simon turned to glance at his garden, feeling the familiar knot in his chest. "It's not as peaceful as it once was," he muttered. "There's a thorn in the corner that's ruining everything." Miriam's eyes softened, and she followed his gaze to the thorn bush, which was now larger than ever, its thorns sharp and cruel, casting a long shadow across the nearby flowers. "It looks tough," she observed, her tone thoughtful. "But I think I understand what you mean." Simon frowned. "You don't understand, Miriam. This thorn is poisoning my whole garden. I've tried everything to get rid of it, but it won't go away. It keeps coming back no matter what I do." Miriam stood beside him, her eyes scanning the garden with a quiet understanding. "I think there's something deeper going on here, Simon." He looked at her, a bit taken aback. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her eyes distant for a moment. "I don't think it's the thorn that's the problem. It's how you're handling it. You're so focused on that one thorn, so angry that it's there, that you've stopped seeing everything else in the garden that's still growing." Simon blinked, caught off guard by her words. "But it's ruining everything, Miriam. How can I focus on the rest of the garden when that thorn keeps stealing the life from my flowers?" Miriam's voice softened, as if choosing her words carefully. "The thorn is only as strong as the power you give it. You can keep fighting it, but if you don't tend to the rest of your garden, you'll lose more than just the flowers. You'll lose the beauty that's still there." Simon felt the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket. He didn't have the answers, and Miriam's perspective was so different from his own. She was right in a way. "But how can I forgive the thorn for what it's done? How can I let go of this anger?" His thoughts swirled, caught in a storm of unresolved emotion. "I don't know how to let go," Simon confessed softly, his voice tight with unspoken frustration. Miriam smiled gently, her eyes filled with a quiet compassion. "I think you'll find that if you start letting go even just a little, your garden will start to heal itself. But you have to want to see the healing happen." Simon nodded, though the knot in his chest remained. Miriam's words lingered in his mind long after she had left. What if she's right? He wondered. What if the key to this thorn lies not in fighting it, but in letting it go? Simon was not one to follow crowds, but when he heard that Jesus, the wandering teacher, would be in the area, something stirred within him. The stories he had heard of Jesus, miracles, healings, and wisdom that seemed to touch the very core of human suffering, had intrigued him for months. Simon had heard whispers of the teacher's words in the village, and a part of him believed that Jesus might hold the answers to the questions that had been plaguing his heart. The thorn in his garden was not the only thorn he carried. There was the thorn of years of disappointment, of betrayals he had never forgiven, of anger he had never let go. The crowd was large when Simon arrived, and he found a place near the front, where he could hear Jesus clearly. The air was thick with anticipation, and Simon could feel the tension in the crowd, an undercurrent of hope and yearning, a collective desire for something more, something beyond the daily struggles of life. Jesus sat on a rock at the center of the gathering, his eyes soft and knowing as he began to speak. The words that came from his mouth were like water to a parched soul, flowing over the crowd with an ease that made everything else fade into the background. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Jesus began, his voice carrying across the sea of faces, "for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Simon felt a stirring deep within him as the words washed over him. He had heard scriptures and teachings before. But there was something different about Jesus' voice, something that spoke not just to the mind but to the heart. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," Simon thought, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the pain he had carried. The bitterness, the wounds from long ago. Could it be true? Could comfort really come from mourning? Asterisk asterisk. Jesus spoke of love and forgiveness, of mercy and peace. His words were not commands but invitations, inviting Simon and all who listened to lay down their burdens, to let go of the anger that bound them, and to find freedom in love. Each word felt like a balm on Simon's aching heart, but there was one teaching that struck him more than any other. "Forgive and you will be forgiven," Jesus said, his voice full of gentle authority. "Forgive others not just for their sake but for your own. Your heart is a garden. If you let bitterness take root, it will choke out the love that could bloom there. But if you forgive, the garden of your soul will flourish." Simon's heart pounded in his chest. A garden of the soul. The words resonated deeply within him. He felt the truth of them, even if he didn't fully understand them. He had always tended to his physical garden, but his soul, the soil of his spirit, had been neglected for too long. Could it really be that simple? He wondered. Could forgiveness truly heal my heart like water heals the earth? The teachings of Jesus haunted Simon's mind for days. He found himself wrestling with them, pulling them into his heart, turning them over like stones in his hand, trying to make sense of them. Forgiveness. It seemed like such a simple word, but the weight it carried was anything but light. Simon had tried to forgive in the past. He had convinced himself that he had let go of the anger he had harbored for so many years. But the truth was, the thorn of bitterness still lodged itself deep within him. Every time he thought he had forgiven, it seemed to resurface. The past refused to be buried, and the anger refused to be silenced. Each day, Simon found himself standing in front of the thorn bush in his garden, staring at its twisted branches and sharp thorns. He could feel the resentment welling up inside of him again. "I want to let it go," he thought, but the hurt still stung. "How do I forgive something that has caused so much pain? How do I remove this thorn that keeps growing back?" Days turned into weeks, and Simon continued to wrestle with his own emotions. The garden, once his refuge, had become a constant reminder of his internal struggle. The thorn bush had grown stronger, its twisted branches now snaking across the space where his roses used to thrive. Despite his best efforts to nurture the rest of his plants, the shadow of the thorn stretched across the garden, a painful metaphor for the bitterness festering in his heart. The vibrant colors of his lilies, violets, and daisies had faded. The roses, once so full of life, drooped and withered beneath the thorn's oppressive presence. One afternoon, as Simon walked among the flowers, his hands shaking with frustration, he found himself glaring at the thorn bush once again. It seemed almost impossible to get rid of it. Each time he thought he had made progress, it seemed to grow back even more fiercely, mocking him with its resilience. Simon clenched his fists, his thoughts clouded with anger. The thorn felt like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. Betrayals, losses, and the many wrongs he had endured without ever finding peace. But today something felt different. He stopped by the thorn bush, standing still for a moment as his chest tightened. He looked around at the roses, their petals brittle and curling, their once beautiful colors now dull and faded. For a moment, Simon felt a deep sadness, almost as if the roses had become an extension of his own wounded heart. He had spent so many years tending to the garden, trying to make it perfect, only to see it corrupted by this single thorn. And yet, beneath the bitterness that consumed him, a small, quiet voice inside whispered, "You can still nurture the rest of your garden." Simon's heart ached with the realization. His garden had not been completely destroyed. There were still flowers that held their beauty, still life that thrived. The roses may have been struggling, but the violets were still colorful, the lilies still tall and proud. His bitterness had threatened to consume him, just as the thorn had choked the life out of his garden, but there was still hope, still beauty to be found. It wasn't too late. He could still tend to the parts of his heart that were capable of growth. Slowly, Simon knelt by the roses, running his fingers along the dry stems. He took a deep breath, deciding for the first time to tend to what remained, without focusing solely on the thorn. As he pruned the dead leaves from the roses, something inside him began to shift. The act of nurturing felt good, almost like a balm to the wounds he had been carrying for so long. He had spent too much time focusing on the thorn. He had neglected the other parts of his garden, the ones that still had life to give. That evening, as Simon sat on the worn bench at the edge of his garden, a sense of clarity began to settle over him. The wind rustled softly through the olive trees, and the fading light of the sunset painted the garden in soft, golden hues. He closed his eyes, feeling the cool breeze against his face, the scent of the flowers now more distinct after the pruning. For the first time in a long while, his mind felt quiet. The thorns that had plagued him for so long seemed to lose their power. The weight of his anger, which had become so familiar, no longer felt so heavy. It wasn't that the thorn had disappeared, but rather Simon had stopped letting it consume him. He realized that he had been so focused on ridding himself of the thorn that he had forgotten to nurture the parts of his soul that were still capable of growth. He had been trapped in a cycle of bitterness and resentment, unable to move forward because of the hurt others had caused him in the past. But the truth was, as long as he held on to that anger, he would never be free to experience the healing that was possible. Simon's thoughts drifted back to Miriam's words, "The thorn isn't just in your garden. It's in your heart too." Her voice echoed in his mind, and he realized the depth of her wisdom. The thorn wasn't just a physical presence. It was an emotional one. And the more he held on to his pain, the more that pain would stifle the growth of love and peace in his heart. Tears welled in his eyes as he sat there, feeling the full weight of the realization. Forgiveness was not a one-time act, but a process, a slow and steady journey of releasing the things that had hurt him. He couldn't expect to uproot the thorn all at once. It had taken root too deeply. But he could begin the process of loosening its hold on his heart. Just as he had tenderly cared for the other parts of his garden, he could now begin to tend to the broken, bitter parts of his soul. With a deep, shuddering breath, Simon made a decision. He would no longer allow the thorn to dominate his thoughts. He would forgive, not for the sake of those who had wronged him, but for his own healing. He would start small, one step at a time, allowing his heart to heal, like his garden slowly beginning to blossom once again. The next few days were difficult for Simon, filled with moments of doubt and temptation to revert to his old ways. There were times when his thoughts would return to the thorn, and the bitterness would creep back into his heart. But each time Simon reminded himself that healing was not instant. It was a process. He had to work at it, patiently and deliberately, like tending to a garden that had been neglected for too long. As he worked in the garden, Simon began to notice small changes. The roses, while still struggling, had new shoots of growth. The petals weren't as crisp, the stems less brittle. He had focused on caring for the flowers, removing the dead leaves and giving them space to grow. In doing so, the roses had begun to show signs of life again. The same could be said for his heart. Slowly, Simon began to let go of the anger he had held for so long. He started to forgive, not in grand gestures but in quiet, everyday acts. He began by forgiving the small hurts, the things that had seemed insignificant at first but had built up over time. Each act of forgiveness, no matter how small, felt like a weight lifted from his chest. The more he forgave, the more peace he felt creeping back into his soul. And with each step, the thorn began to lose its power over him. Simon also began to reach out to others in the village, reconnecting with those he had once been distant from. He found that, as he opened his heart to others, the love and compassion he shared began to heal the wounds of the past. His garden too responded. The once choked flowers began to bloom more fully, their colors brighter, their stems stronger. It was as if the act of nurturing the flowers had allowed them to tap into the deep well of life that existed within the soil, and within him. It was a few weeks later, as Simon worked in his garden, that he saw a figure approaching in the distance. Jesus. Simon's heart skipped a beat as he drew nearer, his presence calm and reassuring, like the quiet peace Simon had been seeking for so long. The crowd parted to make way for him, and there was a moment of stillness in the air, as if nature itself recognized the arrival of someone truly special. Jesus smiled as he approached Simon, and Simon felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude welling up inside him. "Your garden is healing," Jesus said gently, his eyes twinkling with understanding. Simon stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, feeling both humbled and awed by the presence of the man before him. "It's true. The roses are still struggling, but they're growing again. And my heart." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "My heart is healing too." Jesus looked at him with deep compassion. Healing comes when you stop holding on to the thorns. When you forgive not just for others but for your own peace. You've begun to see that your garden, both the one you tend with your hands and the one you carry in your heart, will flourish when you choose love over bitterness. Simon's chest swelled with emotion. He nodded slowly, unable to speak for a moment, the truth of Jesus' words sinking deep into his soul. "Thank you," he finally whispered. "Thank you for showing me the way." Jesus smiled, placing a hand on Simon's shoulder. "Remember, Simon, that love is the water that nourishes the garden. It is the soil in which forgiveness takes root. Keep tending to your heart, and it will continue to bear fruit." As the seasons changed, Simon continued to tend to both his garden and his heart. The roses that had once been choked by the thorn began to bloom with new vibrancy. The lilies stood tall and proud, their white petals gleaming in the sunlight. The violets returned, soft and fragrant, their delicate colors filling the air with sweetness. The garden, like his heart, had found new life, and Simon knew that this was only the beginning. In his relationships with others, Simon was kinder, more patient. He forgave when he had once held grudges. He listened more deeply. His heart, once heavy with anger, was light with love. The bitterness that had once consumed him had been replaced by a quiet, enduring peace. Each day, Simon took small steps to continue the work of healing, knowing that forgiveness was a daily practice, a continual act of letting go. One evening, as Simon stood at the edge of his garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The garden was more beautiful than ever, and so was his heart. His soul, once burdened by thorns of bitterness, had found freedom. The flowers in his garden, now in full bloom, were a reflection of the love and peace that had taken root in his spirit. Simon closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. "Thank you, Jesus, for showing me the way to healing." The words came from deep within, full of sincerity and warmth. And as he stood there, the garden of his soul blooming in full, Simon knew that this was just the beginning of his journey. He had learned that, like a garden, the heart required constant care, love, and attention. And through love, all things, whether flowers or souls, could grow. As Simon looked toward the horizon, the words of Jesus echoed in his heart. "Forgive and you will be healed. Remove the thorns from your heart and let love bloom. It is through love that all things grow." In that moment, Simon understood that forgiveness was not just for others, it was for himself. And in that truth, he found the peace he had been seeking for so long. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.